Okay, we were talking about the lesson meditations on Westminster Abbey, and we stopped at the, I think, the middle portion of the essay that has been prescribed for you. So we see the narrator walking through the tombs, walking through the graveyard of the Westminster Abbey, looking at all the tombs, and he's sharing his reflections on what he sees there. Like, he sees a lot of tombs with inscriptions, he's looking at the inscriptions, and he's sharing his reflections with us. He passes on and he says, I could not but be very much delighted with several modern epitaphs which are written with great elegance of expression and justness of thought, and therefore do honor to the living as well as to the dead. So he's looking at the epitaphs, the inscription written on the tombstones, and he's reading that, and he says, there are so many epitaphs which are very modern and which are written with a lot of elegant expression. It's written very well, right? And the thought that is conveyed is also just. It is fitting for the person who has been buried there. And he says, when I read the epitaphs, I understand that a lot of honor has been done to the person who is buried there. As a foreigner is very apt to conceive an idea of the ignorance or politeness of a nation from the turn of their public monuments and inscriptions, they should be submitted to the perusal of men of learning and genius before they are put into execution. So, in the previous line, he says, the epitaphs do honor to the living as well as to the dead. Now, how does the epitaph do honor to the living? So, what he means here is, when you read the epitaph, you also come to know much about the nature of the people of that country. What kind of people they are? How do they honor their dead? How do they kind of revere their dead? How do they write epitaphs? What is the style of writing? So it gives you an idea about the nature of the people of that particular country. So then he says, as a foreigner is very apt to conceive an idea of the ignorance or politeness of a nation. So if a person from abroad comes and reads these epitaphs, he will understand whether the people of that country are people who are stupid, or people who are ignorant, or people who are very polite, people who are genteel, who are able to write well. So what should you do? So he says, they should be submitted to the perusal of men of learning and genius before they put into execution. So he says, when you put up an inscription on the epitaph, make sure that people of genius, or people who are actually well read, or people who are well educated, go through it. Perusal means they read through it and they find they go through it and they understand, or they kind of improve the writing. If there are any errors, they should be able to improve the writings. Otherwise, they should be able to read through it and testify that what has been written is absolutely okay. It is grammatically correct, the written expression is correct, the way it has been, the way the thought has been conveyed is good. All those things should be actually given into the perusal of men of learning, and then only you should put it up on the tombstone. You should not simply put up an epitaph without having a person read through it. So any genius should be able to read through it. You should allow a genius to read through it and make any corrections if necessary, because otherwise when a foreigner comes and reads your epitaphs, he or she should not get a wrong idea about your country. Then he goes on, Sir Cloudesley Shovel's monument. He talks about Sir Cloudesley Shovel. He was a very famous English admiral who had led England to many a victory. He was the naval officer, right? Commander of the naval fleet. Sir Cloudesley Shovel's monument has very often given me great offense. So he says, when I look at Sir Cloudesley Shovel's monument, I'm actually very much offended. Why? The reason is, instead of the brave, rough English admiral, which was the distinguishing character of that plain, gallant man, he is represented on his tomb by the figure of a bow, dressed in a long periwig and reposing himself upon velvet cushions under a canopy of state. So, Sir Cloudesley Shovel was a very gallant English admiral. But how is he represented on his tombstone? He is shown as, it is actually the kind of the figure of a bow. A bow means a lover, right? Person, and he's wearing a long periwig, the kind of huge wigs with judges and all wear. So that is how Cloudesley Shovel is represented. It does not give you a correct picture, because this man has led the English fleet to many a victory. Nothing about that is mentioned. The first impression that anyone from outside gets when he or she looks at the inscription or the tombstone of Sir Cloudesley Shovel is that this man would have been a lover, a kind of man with a loose character, wearing a huge periwig. There's nothing mentioned about his gallant deeds. The inscription is answerable to the monument. For instead of celebrating the many remarkable actions he had performed in the service of his country, it acquaints us only with the manner of his death, in which it was impossible for him to reap any honor. Now, what is the inscription? You have the picture of Sir Cloudesley Shovel, and he's not even wearing any naval uniform. He's represented as a beau, right? A beau who is actually wearing a periwig, a person dressed very lavishly as a lover. So there is no indication that this man would have been a gallant admiral. Now, what is the inscription? There's no mention about the brave deeds he has performed. What is mentioned then? What is mentioned is how he died. Now, this man died in a shipwreck, and it was actually a mistake on his part. He led the English fleet on a route on the Atlantic Ocean, and unfortunately, the fleet dashed against a group of rocks. So it was a mistake. So that is what is written, that he died in a shipwreck. So that does not give you give the person who is reading about Cloudesley Shovel a correct picture about this man, right? It's only mentioned about his death, and that death is not something that would give him any honor. Now he speaks about the Dutch. He says the Dutch, whom we are apt to despise for want of genius, show an infinitely greater taste of antiquity and politeness in their buildings and works of this nature than what we meet within those of our own country. So he says, you know, when we look at the Dutch, we always hold the Dutch. In English, people hold the Dutch in contempt. But the Dutch, when they build their inscriptions, when they build their monuments, how do they represent them? You know, he says in that they have a great taste for antiquity and politeness. The monuments of their admirals, like look at Cloudesley Shovel's monument and look at the monument of a Dutch admiral, which have been created at public expense, represent like themselves and are adorned with rostral crowns and naval ornaments with beautiful festoons of seawood, shells and coral. So when you look at the tombstones of the Dutch admirals, you see that they are decorated with rostral crowns. It's a golden crown, especially given to a person who performs a great feat during the naval command. You know, like maybe, you know, you're going to attack an enemy ship, and the first person who jumps into the enemy ship is given a golden crown. That's called a rostral crown. So all the admirals, the Dutch admirals monuments, when you look at them, you see how aptly they are decorated. They, you know, they speak volumes about that person's gallant deeds. They're festoons of seawood, shells and coral and naval ornaments. And when you look at, say, Cloudesley Shovel's monument, you don't even get a picture that this man was a gallant admiral. You know, he's dressed as a beau, right? Wearing a huge periwig. So that gives you a wrong picture. And any foreigner looking at that would get a wrong picture about the admirals of England. And he says, look at the tombs of the admirals of the Dutch people. They have done it so well. But to return to our subject, I have left the repository of our English kings for the contemplation of another day, when I shall find my mind disposed for so serious an amusement. So he says, now I'm just coming back to what I was looking at. I have left the repository. Repository means a receptacle, the place where they are kept, you know, stored. I have left the repository of our English kings. I'm not going to speak about the English kings. I was speaking about poets. I was speaking about admirals. Now I'll speak about English kings on another day, when I shall find my mind disposed for so serious an amusement. When I find, you know, when I'm serious enough to go again to Westminster Abbey and look at all the monuments. Today I've spoken about poets. I've also spoken about admirals. I'll speak about kings some other day. I know that entertainments of this nature are apt to raise dark and dismal thoughts in timorous minds and gloomy imaginations. So he says, you know, this kind of entertainments, this kind of moving around in tombstones are apt to raise dark and dismal thoughts in timorous minds. Timorous minds means minds which are not courageous, minds which are very feeble, right? And gloomy imagination. So people who are not very courageous, people who are very feeble-minded, people who have got very gloomy, melancholic imaginations, they wonder what is wrong with this man who is always walking around in tombstone. So this is a serious amusement, spending time in tombstone, reflecting on the epitaphs written there, looking at the writings there, right? So he says that's a very dismal kind of amusement, a dismal leisure time, right? And people will always think, why is he doing this? Dark thoughts, gloomy thoughts would come into minds which are very feeble. Why should you go to the tombstone and spend your time there? Is that a time to spend your, is that a way to spend your leisure time? But for my part, he says, but for my part, though I am always serious, I do not know what it is to be melancholy. He says, I'm a very serious person. I don't know how to be sad. I'm very serious. I'm not melancholic, right? And can therefore take a view of nature in a deep and solemn scenes with the same pleasure as in her most gay and delightful ones. So he says, I am a very serious person. I'm not a melancholic person. I'm not a person who always gives into sadness. I can take, he says, I can take whatever is presented in nature, whether it is solemn and whether it is delightful. Both of these scenes of nature give me the same kind of pleasure. I can go to tombstones. I can go to visit tombstones. I can go to the graveyard. I find the same pleasure as going to a place where nature is at its best delightful manner. So both these aspects give me the same kind of pleasure. I can find pleasure in the solemn scenes of nature, in the serious scenes of nature, as well as in the most delightful scenes. So he says there are people who would not be comfortable going to graveyards or looking at tombstones. But I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable there. I'm also comfortable in the so-called most delightful parts or delightful places of nature. By this means, I can improve myself with those objects which others consider with terror. So he says, I always look at things as a means to improve myself. For example, for certain people, the graveyard would be a scene of terror. But I look at the graveyard and I learn something from there. I look at the epitaphs on the tombstones and I learn something from there. I always look upon these things. And I try to improve myself. Sometimes people might look upon certain objects with terror. I don't have terror. Why should I be terrified? I'm not at all terrified. I'm not at all melancholic. I look upon these the dismal he says in quotes, these dismal scenes of nature which other people look upon with terror. I look upon such dismal scenes of nature as a stepping stone for me to improve myself, as a place for me to learn something new. Now, how does he explain that? He says, when I look upon the tombs of the great, every emotion of envy dies within me. I look at the tombs of great people, the so-called great people of the world, people who have been held in high regard and high esteem. I look at these people's tombs, and tombs, and if at all there is one iota of envy within me, if at all there is one single grain of jealousy within me, it just dies, right? When I read the epitaphs of the beautiful, the writings on the tombstones, every inordinate desire goes out, every kind of excessive desire, the desire to possess, the desire to be like the other person. When I read the inscriptions of the so beautiful people, all these things just goes out of my mind. When I meet with the grief of parents upon a tombstone, my heart melts with compassion. When I see the tombs of the parents themselves, I consider the vanity of grieving for those whom we must quickly follow. So he says, when I look upon the tombs of children who have died, I sympathize, I mourn, and I cry with the parents. When I look at the tombs of the parents, I realize that, okay, what is the point, we'll also be joining them soon. Why should we grieve for people whom we will also quickly follow? When I see kings lying by those who deposed them, when I consider rival wits placed side by side, or the holy men that divided the world with their contests and disputes, I reflect with sorrow and astonishment on the little competitions, factions, and debates of mankind. So he says, I look at kings lying next to the same people who defeated them, right? Buried next to the same people who defeated them. Then he says, I see rival wits placed side by side. Intelligent people who are always quarreling with each other, who are always competing with each other, now placed side by side. I see holy men that divided the world with their contests and disputes. He says there are holy men who have got their own ideologies, their own theories. They divide the world. But today, what do you see? You see two people who divided the world lying side by side. And then he says, I reflect with sorrow and astonishment. I understand. And I feel that, it is so sad that we spend so much of time fighting with each other. We spend so much of time destroying each other. Ultimately, what happens to each one of us? We will all be placed in the same position. And there is no point fighting with each other. I look at all this and I think, it is useless, it is futile to fight with each other. When I read of the several dates of the tombs of some that died yesterday and some 600 years ago, I consider that great day when we shall all of us be contemporaries and make our appearance together. So he says, when I look at the dates of people who died, some who died yesterday, some who died many, many years ago, some who died today, I just understand that there'll be one day when all of us will be contemporaries. All of us will be buried under the same earth. We'll all be lying close to each other. Whether we were rivals or whether we were kings or whether we were beautiful or whether we were ugly, whatever it is, whether we were enemies or friends or parents or children, we will all be lying next to each other. There'll be one great day for all of us when all of us will become contemporaries. Now on this earth, we're not contemporaries. We fight with each other. We kind of envy each other, right? We always compete with each other. But there'll come a day when all of us will be lying together under the same earth. So that is how this essay becomes a reflective essay. He reflects on the nature of mankind, how mankind is so puny, they fight with each other. Every human being is always envious of the other person. You're always comparing yourself with the other person. But ultimately, the man forgets to realize that one day he also will be lying with the same person whom he is fighting with today under the ground. So that is the essay for you. I hope you have understood that.